My name is AP Hawkins. I'm a science fiction and fantasy writer, and I'm an editor with Tomeworks, who are all my fellow Writers Lunch co-hosts. And I'm currently querying a novel, and I am really working hard on finishing a draft of a second one. So my brain is kind of dead outside of that right now. But I wanted to come on here today and talk to you guys about story structure a little bit, because we had some questions in a previous Writers Lunch or in a previous event that we did about story structure. So I thought it would make a good topic for Writers Lunch. Now, of course, there are many ways to tell a story. And like if we were to go into all the details of story structure and look at examples of different story structures from, all over the world and, all different cultures, I mean, we could make a whole college level course, a whole semester out of just talking about story structure. So this is going to be a brief introduction to story structure with some case studies of stories that I am very familiar with and that fit into story structures that I am also familiar with. So again, this is not meant to be completely comprehensive of all story structures everywhere. So just keep that in mind as we're going, that there's a lot more out there to discover about story structure than what we'll have time to cover today. So why is story structure important? One of the main reasons that's kind of considering story structure when you're writing is important is because of reader expectations. Readers have certain, readers of specific genres, right? They have certain expectations of what that genre is and what books in that genre are, and kind of the general flow of a story and how that story is structured. And a lot of times readers, if those expectations are violated in a way that they don't find satisfying, then they're not really going to like the story. So story structure kind of helps you keep reader expectations in mind when you're writing. It also can help you build characters and plots. If you're writing and you get stuck, thinking about story structure can really help you continue on and build out the rest of your story. And for me, personally, that's kind of the only time that I really think consciously about story structure, because I have all this information in my brain, right? But when I go to write a story, I don't set out to make that story fit a particular structure. I just draw on my experience and the information that I have sort of unconsciously while I'm writing the story. But if I get stuck, it really helps sometimes to consider, the structure of my story and the kind of thing that I am, trying to get across and the arcs that I'm trying to build with my characters. And it's important to know kind of what, this goes along with the reader expectations, but it's important to kind of know what the quote rules are. So when you break them, you can do it in a way that is satisfying for readers of that genre, rather than making them feel like they've been cheated. So if you know what those expectations are, what that kind of structure kind of tends to be in your genre, you can kind of subvert that in a way that readers will find more satisfying. And, again, it's not necessary to strictly fit a mold of a particular story structure, but it's helpful to think about how your story and characters fit to kind of make a satisfying story. So I'm checking the chat. Okay, no questions in the chat yet. Okay. But yeah, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat anytime. I'll check it every so often. So some examples of story structures. I've talked a little bit about the hero's journey on Writer's Lunch before, but I'm going to get more in depth into it today. This was a story structure that was developed by Joseph Campbell, and his idea or his theory was that this is a universal storytelling structure, which is not true. Just nip that in the bud. There is no universal storytelling structure. There are many ways to tell a story. But he was kind of looking at mostly Western European stories and seeing patterns. And out of these patterns, he kind of developed this idea of the hero's journey, or the monomyth, which we'll talk about more later. You may have heard of Save the Cat, which is a 3-act story structure that was developed for screenwriters. It's kind of based on the hero's journey. And this is actually, even though it was kind of developed for screenwriters, a lot of writers actually find it helpful to follow kind of a Save the Cat type of structure when they're writing their stories. So definitely check that out. I don't use Save the Cat myself, and I'm only marginally familiar with it, but I do know a lot of people find it helpful, and there are worksheets online that you can fill out following a Save the Cat structure. Yeah, in the chat, Save the Cat Writes a Novel is another book. Yeah, they later took, or I don't know, I think it was the same authors, same guy who wrote Save the Cat. I think he later wrote Save the Cat Writes a Novel because a lot of writers were like finding like fiction or like, not screenwriters, but like novel writers were finding Save the Cat helpful, and he wanted to make it even more helpful to them. And you may have heard of school if you took a literature. Oops, I am scrolling all the way through my thing. I did not mean to do that. If you took a literature class in high school or college, you may have heard of the Freytag's Pyramid and the Fitchian Curve story structures that are kind of a 3-act kind of curve structure. We'll look at those a little bit later. And then we also have a lot of examples of non-Western storytelling, which stories that don't come from a Western or a European tradition. And none of these cultures are monoliths. So, these cultures have many different ways of telling stories, but just some examples from those cultures. You have the Kisho Tenketsu, which is a 4-act kind of East Asian structure that has its roots in Chinese poetry, but it has spread throughout China, Japan, and North and South Korea. Frame stories are actually a Middle Eastern structure. I think the earliest known frame story is 1001 Nights. And so but you might be familiar with The Princess Bride. It's also a frame story. But, that structure has its roots in Middle Eastern culture. And then in Native American and African traditions, you generally get oral and nonlinear storytelling styles. And again, like these cultures are not monoliths, and it varies based on, what specific culture you're looking at, whether, a specific Native American culture or a specific African culture. But in general, they have some general like common patterns. And a lot of those are like oral storytelling, nonlinear storytelling, collaborative storytelling, and things like that. I'm not going to talk a lot about those types of story structures today because they're not structures that I personally am particularly familiar with. I do have some resources in my slides that I'm going to copy them and put them in the chat. If you want to learn more about Native American storytelling styles and African storytelling styles, you can, these links are a good place to start. They're certainly not comprehensive, but you can start there. Oh no, I'm sending it to the wrong chat. Okay. There we go. All right. What I am going to focus on today is more of Western storytelling structures. And I also had a lot of exposure to like Japanese media growing up. So I'm familiar with the Kisho Tenketsu structure as well. So I'll be talking about that too today. But first, let's talk about the Freytag's Pyramid and the Fitchian Curve. So the Freytag's Pyramid, this is the one that I saw in school, in my high school literature classes. And the story always starts with exposition. You're doing your world building, you're introducing your characters, you're doing kind of a normal life type of deal. What is their normal life like? And then you have an inciting incident, which leads to the rising action. So the inciting incident could be, Gandalf discovering that the ring that Frodo has is the One Ring and it needs to be destroyed. And so Frodo, you have to take it to Mordor. Or Frodo, you have to get it out of the Shire. That's kind of the inciting incident for Lord of the Rings, is when Gandalf comes to Frodo and is like, hey, this cannot stay here. You have to take it, to Elrond. And then other example would be Luke in Star Wars when his aunt and uncle are murdered. That's kind of the inciting incident that causes him to leave Tatooine, because if they had been alive, he might have stayed. He wanted to stay home with them. He wouldn't have gone off on his journey. So the inciting incident is what sets the character on their journey. And then after the inciting incident, the action of the story rises to the climax, which is like the final battle, final confrontation, the destroying of the big bad guy, Frodo throwing the ring into Mount Doom, etc. And then falling action, where you're kind of wrapping up the loose ends, and then the denouement, which is going back to your normal life, or as much as you can. The Fitchian Curve is a little bit different from this. And someone mentioned in the chat, most James Bond films seem to be a Fitchian Curve. Yeah, the Fitchian Curve is very common in film, extremely common in film, because what happens at the Fitchian Curve is you're essentially starting with an inciting incident, or very nearly. You don't have a lot of exposition or world building at the beginning. You're starting with something's happening that's weird, and it's going to set our character on a specific path. And then the action kind of builds from crisis to crisis with the character. And you kind of have, moments where the action kind of dips between each crisis, where the character has a moment to breathe, but they don't last very long. And each crisis, as you go through the Fitchian curve, is bigger than the previous one until you get to the climax. And so essentially what the Fitchian curve is it's like an abbreviated version of the Freytag's pyramid, where you're kind of cutting off the exposition and the denouement, and you're just doing the inciting incident, action rising to climax, and then the falling action, where you're kind of wrapping up everything. And again, like I mentioned, this is very popular in film. I think, a lot of times you can write or create a much more abbreviated story if you use a Fitchian curve type of structure, because you don't have those long kind of parts at the beginning and the end where you're, doing regular daily life things. And I think modern audiences tend to find it more engaging because it gets you right into the story pretty much right away. One really good example of the Daphne in the chat, you said mispronouncing denouement wrong my whole life. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, so don't use me as an example.
No, you're good. You're good. Denouement. Yeah.
Okay.
I was over here like denouement.
But anyway, one really good example of the Fitchian curve is Martian. If you've seen The Martian, or even if you've read it, even in the book, Martian is a really good example of the Fitchian curve. It starts right away with like that inciting incident. He's alone on Mars and he has to figure out how to survive. So yeah, if you haven't read The Martian or seen the movie, I definitely recommend it. It's a really good example of this type of storytelling structure. So in general, and again, big generalization here, but in general, Western storytelling has kind of specific characteristics kind of go along with structure, or kind of inform the structure of stories. And some of these are, the story is kind of driven by the character's goals. If the main character doesn't have a goal, there is no story in this case. There's the main character tends to have a lot of growth throughout the course of the story, where, when you have the kind of the Freytag's pyramid, where you have the denouement on the end, they are in a different place. Even if they're going back to their normal daily life, they are not the same person that they were during the exposition part of the story, because things that they have experienced and done throughout the course of the story has changed them. Conflict tends to be introduced early and always kind of rises toward the climax. And the ending of the story resolves this conflict. At the end of Lord of the Rings, Frodo throws the ring into Mount Doom and Sauron is destroyed. That central conflict of the story is resolved. At the end of Star Wars, Luke has, defeated the Emperor, and the Empire is dissolving and the rebellion is victorious. And so that central conflict of that whole story is resolved by the end. And Western stories tend to value individualism, personal success, again, the character achieving their goals, overcoming conflict, and again, all of these things are kind of centered around the main character. Now, in contrast, in a non-Western example, and this is specific to the Kisho Tenketsu form, which I'll be talking about more later, but in contrast, the Kisho Tenketsu form, a lot of people talk about it as being conflictless, which is not true. There is conflict in a Kisho Tenketsu, but the conflict isn't necessarily the point of the story. Resolving the conflict is not the point of the story. The characters generally aren't goal-driven. They react to what's happening around them rather than being proactive and causing things to happen. And the end of a Kisho Tenketsu story kind of emphasizes like a perspective, shift in perspective, or a shift in philosophy. And it may not resolve the conflict. And in a lot of cases, it doesn't resolve the conflict. It just, the characters have a shift in perspective that, may allow them to kind of embrace the conflict, if that makes sense. And a lot of Kisho Tenketsu stories tend to value community, family, the greater good. They're not really centered around individualism or the main character achieving their goals. They're centered around, coming together as a community. So I'm gonna check the chat. Let's see. Okay, a question from Jean. Are there any examples where there is no character growth? Yes. non-linear storytelling traditions, such as some Native American traditions and some African traditions, you get characters who appear again and again and again in multiple stories. They don't really tend to change. Like, for example, in like a lot of Native American stories, you have the characters of like, Coyote or Raven, and they show up in multiple stories. But because the storytelling like tradition is non-linear, there's no drive toward an ultimate goal for those characters where they are changed along the way. Daphne, did you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, I wanted to point out that even in Western tradition, there are stories with no character growth. And typically those stories are tragedies. Because the character doesn't change to their circumstances and therefore is not able to succeed.
Romeo and Juliet. But yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Yeah. And even in, yes, there are plenty of examples of storytelling structures and styles where characters don't really grow or change. And, whether, and like Daphne said, a lot of times that's kind of like the point of the story, and it ends in a tragedy because they don't adapt to their changing circumstances. So yes, but let's see. Okay, I'm looking at the chat again. Okay, Sean is suggesting mysteries. Yeah, if you have the type of series that Shannon talked about.
Cozy mysteries, things like the static protagonist.
Yeah.
Yeah, she gave an interesting talk on how to write a series like that. So that'll be like your Miss Marples or your Hercule Poirot. Yeah. James Bond is also an example of a character who is a static character. And so those are very plot-driven stories rather than character-driven stories.
Yeah. I'm totally going to agree with Daphne up to Daniel Craig, who is, it's really the writers, but like they've tried to make James Bond into a more dynamic character and string them together more like, I don't know, Mission Impossible movies, what's his name? Tom Cruise's character changes his relationships as they go through. But yeah, as he was written in the books, totally static character. And yeah, totally.
Yeah. All right. So I have chosen kind of two storytelling structures to get kind of in depth about today. The first is the hero's journey, which again, I have talked about this before on Writer's Lunch, but the last time I talked about it, I was really only talking about the character archetypes and not the story structure itself. So this time we're going to get into the story structure. And one of the best ways that I have found to kind of discuss story structure is with case studies. So I have chosen Star Wars as a case study for the hero's journey. And if you're wondering, this is for writers, Anna, why are you talking about a movie? The reason that I've chosen movies to talk about this is because movies, they are also writing. One, someone had to write the script, but two, the movies tend to be really accessible to a lot of people. And, if I were to choose a book to talk about story structure, even if it were a very popular book, there's less of a chance that the audience or that the majority of the audience is familiar with the basics of the story of the book than with a movie like Star Wars, where most people are at least marginally familiar with what the story is. So that's why I've kind of chosen movies to talk about this, because, and yes, pointing out it was a book too. Yes, there is a Star Wars. There are many Star Wars books actually, but I'm losing my train of thought. Anyway, movies are a really good way to talk about story structure using examples that people tend to be familiar with, because if you're already familiar with the story, I don't have to explain the part of the story to talk about the structure. So, all right, going into this. The Hero with a Thousand Faces is a book by Joseph Campbell. It's very academic, but basically it kind of outlines his theory of the, quote, monomyth, the universal story, which, again, it's not a universal story. It's not a monomyth. Not everyone tells stories this way, but this is the pattern that he saw looking at mainly European stories when he was kind of figuring out this theory. So the basic kind of idea of the hero's journey, the monomyth, is a hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. So that's the basic hero's journey. This was later adapted, and of course, in Hero with a Thousand Faces, Joseph Campbell lays out like 17 different stages of the hero's journey and various character archetypes. So later, Christopher Vogler adapted the Hero with a Thousand Faces into a book called The Writer's Journey, and this book was more kind of made to help writers actually use the hero's journey. So it kind of distilled the very academic Hero with a Thousand Faces into a usable storytelling guide. So the main criticisms of kind of this structure, or at least of Joseph Campbell's idea for this structure, right, is source selection bias. So I've mentioned a couple of times that he developed this theory of it being a monomyth when he was looking at mainly Western European stories. So there is selection bias in his sources. He was not looking at stories from all over the world. He was just looking at stories from one small part of it. And also, people have criticized it for having a lack of specificity, which I'm not really sure about that, but whatever. It's a criticism that people have had of it. So again, like I said, originally there were 17 stages in the hero's journey. You will see in my graphic that there are only 12. And this graphic is from Vogler's adaptation of the hero's journey. He adapted the 17 stages into 12, and this is the most popular kind of version of this structure that's used now. There are also 8, quote, universal character archetypes. And one of the things about this structure is that characters can fit different archetypes at different stages of their journey. So you'll see on my graphic here, we've got the ordinary world and the special world. So the hero, and this is all centered around the main character, around the hero. The hero starts in the ordinary world. He has a call to adventure. That's his inciting incident. He may refuse the call initially and then meet a mentor that encourages him to take the first step on his journey. And that's when you cross the first threshold from the ordinary world into the special world, where you're going to start encountering your testing the hero. The hero is going to start gaining allies, making enemies, or encountering enemies. And over the course of that approaches the final ordeal, which is, the kind of the final conflict, the final resolution of the conflict, and gains some sort of boon from doing that, and then has to go back to from the special world back into the ordinary world with this, boon or special power that the character has encountered over the course of their journey. So we're going to go through this with Star Wars. I hope that everyone is at least marginally familiar with Star Wars. If you're not, you will be by the time we're done. So we're going to start with the character archetypes of the hero's journey as exemplified by Star Wars characters. Obviously, first, we have the hero. This is Luke Skywalker. He is our protagonist. He undergoes challenges and transformations over the course of his story. He is an ordinary person called to an adventure. That's kind of the main trait of the hero, is they are an ordinary person who's called to adventure. And over the course of his adventure, he gains knowledge or power that he needs to succeed in his final goal. Opposite the hero, we have the shadow. And this one is a little bit tricky for Star Wars. The shadow, it can be Darth Vader. It's also kind of the Empire or the Emperor. But in A New Hope, it's really, Darth Vader is like the main bad guy who's like there. But, the goal over the course of the story kind of expands out. And the shadow, behind the shadow, the deeper shadow, is the Empire and the Emperor, and getting rid of that. So the shadow is generally the main antagonist and is usually the hero's mirror or foil, in which case Darth Vader fits this perfectly. He is the anti-Luke Skywalker, and he reflects the darker aspects of the hero. He is what Luke could be if Luke fell to the temptation of the dark side. Right. So that is the shadow character. The shadow can also be metaphorical. Sometimes the hero's main struggle is internal, not external. And in that case, the shadow would be metaphorical and not necessarily a physical person. Then you have the mentor character. This is Star Wars, this is Obi-Wan Kenobi. In Lord of the Rings, this is Gandalf. This is the hero's guide or teacher, usually wise and experienced in a way that the hero needs to learn from them in order to succeed in their final quest. Sometimes the mentor also serve as heralds. The herald being the archetype character who brings the call to adventure, which we'll talk about later, or threshold guardians, which are characters who are kind of an obstacle for the hero. But in this case, Obi-Wan is simply the mentor, and he does kind of give Luke the final push out the door that he needs to leave Tatooine in the first place. There is an opposite archetype to the mentor, which is the shadow mentor, who may mislead the hero, and they are generally on the side of the antagonist of the shadow character, but the hero doesn't know that, at least at first. So in a hero's journey, the hero has allies. So in Star Wars, Luke's allies are Han Solo, Chewbacca, Leia Organa. These characters are meant to support and or accompany the hero on their journey, on their quest to achieve their final goal. And their skills tend to kind of complement the hero's skills. They're often seen as sidekicks. So if you're thinking of, Han and Chewie is Han's sidekick, not really Luke's sidekick. But these characters generally offer help to the hero. And so in Star Wars, Luke, Chewie, and Leia are helping Luke or Han, Chewie, and Leia are helping Luke at various points in the story. All right, I mentioned the Herald before. So the Herald archetype in Star Wars, R2-D2 fits this archetype. The herald initiates the call to adventure, brings it to the hero. So in Star Wars, R2-D2 brings Leia Organa's message for Obi-Wan to Tatooine, kind of forces Luke to get out of his aunt and uncle's farm and go talk to Obi-Wan in the first place. So what R2-D2 is doing is delivering this news that Luke needs to begin his journey. Another archetype is the trickster. In Star Wars, this is C-3PO. This is comic relief. The trickster is the comic relief of the story. They can be an ally or an enemy. Obviously, in this case, C-3PO is an ally, and typically they cause trouble or they get into trouble, and they have to be saved by the hero. So in Star Wars, this happens in the second movie when they're in Cloud City. C-3PO is getting into trouble and has to be rescued, not by Luke, because Luke's not there. He has to be saved by Han Solo. And so there's a little bit of a shift in Han Solo's role for that portion of the second movie where he is actually acting in the hero role to kind of keep this group together until Luke is able to come and ultimately get them out of there. So this other archetype is the Tempter. This is Darth Vader. He tempts Luke to join the dark side. So the Tempter is, or the Temptress, is it actually, in its original form, it was just the Temptress, and they were always women, femme fatales, that tried to pull the hero off his path of righteousness. But the Tempter can be male or female in modern interpretation. And the Tempter offers a temptation or a distraction to divert the hero from their path. So, Darth Vader is, oh, I'm your father, you join me and we can, be really powerful and rule over everybody together. So he is tempting Luke with this promise of family and power. And he is a very charismatic presence, very persuasive. He has a very large weight of personality. I mean, even like watching him on screen, every time he comes on screen in the movie, he's like, taking over the scene because the character and the character design has such a weight of personality to it. And the Tempter is generally used to explore themes of corruption, temptation, ethical dilemmas that the hero might face. And in this case, Darth Vader faced kind of the same types of temptations that he is directing toward Luke, and he fell to them and he failed. And so that is, how it's kind of exploring, is Luke stronger than his father was? Can he resist this temptation that his father could not? So another character archetype in the hero's journey is the shapeshifter. This is a character whose loyalty and role are often kind of unclear. And that's why I think Lando Calrissian fits this archetype very well in Star Wars, because he is a friend of Han's, but he has also made this kind of deal with the Empire, but he's not really happy about it either. So his role kind of like, or his loyalties kind of like shift throughout his portion of the story. And he, at certain times, he acts as both an ally and an enemy, and then ultimately becomes an ally in the end. But the unpredictability of the shapeshifter can add complexity to a hero's journey story. I think this is the last one. Let's see. There are a lot of these. Yes. Oh no. going way too far. So the last character archetype that we have is the Threshold Guardian, who is a character that challenges the hero as they progress through their story. And they kind of represent the hero's fears and force the hero to kind of master new skills. And so this is Yoda. Luke goes to Dagobah to train with Yoda, and Yoda kind of serves as a obstacle for him. And Luke has to kind of succeed at Yoda's training before he can face Vader. And obviously he fails, right? He fails in the cave. He's not able, when he does have to face Darth Vader for the first time, he's not ready. And that's why he can't prevail in the first case. But the Threshold Guardians, they can be aspects of the shadow, but they're not always. Obviously, Yoda is not a shadow character. He is a good aligned character, but he is kind of forcing Luke to kind of face some of the worst aspects of himself in order to continue on his journey. All right, so getting into the journey itself. So we're going to start with Luke's goal, and we're going to go through the original trilogy here. So Luke's goal is to destroy the Empire. That's the goal that he's setting out to achieve in Star Wars. There is a hidden goal that he kind of discovers along the way, which is to fight the dark side and destroy the Sith. And so both of these goals, in order to be successful in his hero's journey, he has to achieve both of these goals. So obviously, when we start in A New Hope, he's in the ordinary world. He has R2 brings the call to adventure, brings the message that leads him to kind of meet his mentor, Obi-Wan, and provides the call to adventure. And initially he refuses to go. He says, I can't leave. My aunt and uncle need me. I can't just go wandering off, who knows where in the galaxy to fight some entity that I don't really know exists. But he is pushed to accept the call because the Empire actually kills his family. And so then he leaves Tatooine, enters the special world in which, he is completely ripped out of his daily life. And that first threshold is leaving Tatooine in the first place. And over the course of the first movie, he meets his allies, and they're kind of going on a quest to steal the Death Star plans and rescue the princess. And so they're kind of approaching this final ordeal in A New Hope, which is to destroy the Death Star. And so to do that, they have to succeed at stealing the plans, rescuing the princess, joining up with the Rebel Alliance. And then they have to actually fight the battle against the Death Star. And then obviously once they do, they succeed. Luke is rewarded by the rebellion, and now he doesn't go back to his ordinary world, right? Because his ordinary world has changed. And that's why this circle is a really good way of representing the hero's journey, because they don't end up, I wish I had a pointer. Can y'all see my mouse? They don't end up right back here on this arc that they were on before. They're over here on this side. And so he could go back after A New Hope is over. He could go back to Tatooine, but his ordinary world is gone. His aunt and uncle are dead. There's no point in going back. So his ordinary world is changed. His ordinary world is now fighting with the rebellion against the Empire. So then we go into The Empire Strikes Back. Luke is in his ordinary world, working with the rebellion, fighting the Empire, and he gets another call to adventure. He gets a vision from beyond, from Obi-Wan, again the mentor setting him on his path of adventure, and he has to cross this. He has to go to Dagobah to train with Yoda, and so that is him kind of meeting that first threshold, right? That's his threshold, is having to succeed in his training with Yoda. And so as he kind of works through this first threshold, he fails, right? He fails to kind of cross into this area where he has the tools that he needs to be successful at achieving his ordeal. But he continues toward it anyway because he has to save his friends. So his final ordeal in The Empire Strikes Back is his temptation by Vader in Cloud City. And he is not prepared for this because he did not succeed in Yoda's trials. He failed in the cave. He confronted the darkest side of himself, and he did not succeed in that confrontation. And so he kind of fails in this ordeal. He runs away. He doesn't succeed in, he doesn't fall for Vader's temptation, but he also doesn't triumph over him either. So, but then, they escape Cloud City and they're back in their ordinary world of working with the rebellion again. So then again, in the Return of the Jedi, we're going again around this circle. We have to rescue the friends and infiltrate the enemy stronghold, which serves as another threshold for Luke. And once again, he's being tempted by the Emperor. He's fighting with Vader, but now he has the skills that he needs because he's gone back and, kind of succeeded with Yoda where he failed before and has been acknowledged as a true Jedi. So now he has the tools that he needs to succeed in his final ordeal, which is destroying the Empire by destroying the Sith Emperor. And this ends up being his final victory, where they go back and the rebellion has been victorious. So that's kind of Luke's basic hero's journey and kind of the major ordeals that he faces over the course of this journey as he goes through the Star Wars, the original Star Wars trilogy. In the chat, doesn't Yoda wear two hats? He's also a mentor here and in later series as well. Yes, Yoda does also serve as a mentor. Luke as well, particularly after Obi-Wan dies and Luke goes to train with him the first time. He is guarding that threshold, but at the same time, he is acting as a mentor. There's another question. Can the character types, journey, and Western storytelling be used in anime, books, or movies and TV shows? Yes. There's a lot of crossover, particularly in modern stories, where creators like to use whatever storytelling structure they want, right? So yes, and you can apply hero's journey to a lot of different stories, not necessarily Western ones that, it might not fit exactly, but you have a lot of the same archetypal characters, a lot of the same elements where the hero is being called to adventure and, all has to face, ordeals and trials and gain skills and blah, blah, blah. Like the same basic elements you'll find in a lot of different types of stories. So it's not specific to European stories necessarily. And the reason, it's this particular storytelling structure is not very specific, which kind of allows you to apply it after the fact to a lot of different stories. Doesn't necessarily mean it was the creator's intent, but you can see elements of it in a lot of different stories. I hope that answers the question. So we've talked about Luke's hero's journey. Oh, I'm running out of time. In contrast to Luke's hero's journey, Anakin has a slightly different hero's journey in the prequel trilogy. He is a tragic hero in the prequels. His goal is to become a Jedi so he can protect the people that he loves. And, his external goal is bring balance to the Force because he's the most powerful, Force user. But he fails in both of those goals. And, you could argue that ultimately he succeeds in bringing balance to the Force at the end of the original trilogy because he is the one who throws the Emperor down the tube and ultimately kills him. But in his trilogy, where he is the main hero, he is a tragic hero because he does not succeed at his goal. He sets off on his journey when his potential is discovered. He leaves home and he fails at the first threshold. His first threshold is to be accepted as a Jedi trainee by the Jedi Council, and they say, no, we can't train you. And then, because you're too old. And then, Qui-Gon says, well, I'm going to train him anyway. So, but he's already failed to cross this first threshold into his journey. But, and he actually kind of fails at every threshold that he faces, because his main ones, he's refused by the Jedi Council. Then in Attack of the Clones, he slaughters the Tusken Raiders because he is mad at them. And then in Revenge of the Sith, when he sees visions of Padme dying in childbirth, instead of following Yoda's advice and kind of taking those visions with a grain of salt, he says, no, I have to do something about it. And that leaves him vulnerable to being tempted by Palpatine and allows him to fall to the shadow. So he doesn't get past this final ordeal at the bottom of his circle. He gets stuck there because he fails. When it comes time for him to resist the temptation by Palpatine, he fails it. And then he becomes, in his son's story, he becomes the shadow character and the tempter. Yeah. That's his hero's journey in contrast to Luke's. And that's what kind of a tragic hero looks like. They don't succeed in their hero's journey. They fail. All right, I have a few minutes left. I'm going to talk about the Kisho Tenketsu. Now that we've gone through the hero's journey in depth, we're going to talk about this. My case study for this is The Boy and the Heron. It's a really good example of this storytelling form. If you haven't seen it, I'm sorry. It's been almost 2 years since it was out, so if you really wanted to see it, I feel like you would have seen it by now. But I'm about to spoil the whole dang thing, so hopefully you'll wanna watch it after you hear me talk about it. So what is the Kisho Tenketsu? I've talked about it a little bit already. This is an East Asian 4-act structure with origins in Chinese poetry. It generally emphasizes a change in the perspective of the character rather than the achievement of a goal. And again, it's in 4 parts: the key, the introduction, the show, which is the development, the ten, which is the twist, and the ketsu, which is the conclusion. So we're going to talk about each of the 4 parts of this storytelling structure now. So in the key, in the introduction, we are introduced to the main character, Mahito, and his family. We're given some backstory on Mahito, that he loses his mother in a horribly traumatic incident. His father has recently remarried, and he is forced to leave his entire life behind and move to the country to be with his father's new wife and his new family. We're also introduced to the Heron, who starts off by harassing Mahito, but is promising to lead Mahito to his mother. So we get this, like, in the introduction, we're getting this kind of setup of Mahito's situation and his grief that he's experiencing, and then we're getting kind of this temptation from the Heron that, oh, if you follow me, I'll lead you to your mother, you can find her again. Then we're getting the show, is the next part of the story, the development. And this is where we learn more about Mahito's emotional pain. In this section of the story, he deliberately injures himself. That is kind of the first time that we really see how much he's struggling emotionally. He's refusing to kind of properly grieve his loss because he's having to be strong, and his entire life has been upended, and like, he's just a kid. His entire life has been upended practically overnight. And his stepmother is trying to kind of form a bond with him. She's not an evil stepmother. Get that out. She's not your European evil stepmother. She is actually trying to, like, form a meaningful bond with this damaged kid and help take care of him, and he's completely rejected her and has really, like, hurt her feelings, but he has completely rejected her. And then in this section, she goes missing, and they have to try to find her. And so Mahito, he's helping the other people at their state try to find his stepmother, and he finds this tower in the woods and goes inside and finds this magical world where, oh my gosh, everything's totally different here. But he finds this magical world inside the tower that is connected to him and his mother's side of his family. Then in the 10, or the twist, Mahito goes on adventures in this magical world with Himi, who is a kind of past spirit version of his mother. And in the tower, Mahito is rejected by his stepmother. He finds her and he tries to bring her back to their house, but she refuses to go with him. And this is a reflection of how his earlier actions hurt her. So he's having his actions earlier in the story be turned back on him when she rejects him. And also in the tower, they find a wizard who is kind of the creator of this magical world and is Mahito's uncle. And the wizard is telling Mahito, or is kind of tempting him, is like, this magical world can only continue to exist if you, Mahito, take over control of it, because it has to pass to someone in the family. And so you would have to leave your whole world behind, leave behind all your grief and this world that you have kind of decided that you hate, to take control of this magical world. So this is kind of the twist where Mahito is experiencing the direct effects of his own actions against his stepmother, and he is reconnecting with his own mother, and he's also being tempted to leave his world behind because, why would he want to stay there? It's full of grief and pain. He could just stay here and rule this magical world and be happy anyway. But his kind of perspective throughout the course of his journey through this magical world has changed. And so this is where we enter the ketsu, the reconciliation. He refuses the wizard's request and chooses to return to the real world because he has learned over the course of his journey and, seeing how his actions hurt his stepmother and, having that kind of closure with his own mother, he has learned how to live with his own grief instead of running away from it. And the Japanese title of this movie is How Do You Live? So, which is a more apt title for the actual story than The Boy and the Heron, because the story is about Mahito learning how to live with his grief rather than running away from it. And in the end, he chooses to love the people who love him rather than leaving them behind. So that's kind of the basic 4 steps of the Kisho Tenketsu. And if you haven't seen this film, this is a really fantastic film. Came out a couple of years ago. You should definitely check it out. If only see this example of the Kisho Tenketsu in action, if for nothing else. So that is it. I managed to do right at 2:00 for that. So I hope that this was interesting for you. I know that storytelling structure or story structure, again, like I said at the beginning, we could be here for an entire college semester if we went into depth about, more than what we did today. So yeah, I hope that the examples were interesting. I hope that you kind of feel like you have a little bit of an understanding of hero's journey and the archetypes that are included in that storytelling structure, and kind of a basic overview of the Kisho Tenketsu, the 4 different parts, and kind of how storytelling structures can be different depending on who is telling the story and the cultural context of the story as well. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming. I appreciate y'all being here. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I did not, let's see. Okay, so next week we are going to have Shannon talking about Amazon listings for books and how to, what common mistakes you might make in listing books on Amazon, and how to fix them. So
yeah, for self-published authors.
Yeah, so for self-published authors, as you're making your listings for Amazon, we're going to go through some examples of mistakes that people have made and how you can avoid doing those for yourself.
Yeah, cool.
Thank you, Anna.
Yep.
Yeah.
For those of you who might have missed part of the presentation, we should be having this up on YouTube and Facebook soon.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
See y'all next week.